Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Jack. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at Newton Public Library, and I'm so excited to be with you online this evening with Marlena Fiol and Ed O'Connor, the authors of Called, and we're going to get into what they have to share with us here in just a moment. But I always have to start us off with a few plugs for other stuff that's coming up at the library. Those of you that are in Newton or within driving distance, I can't let it go by that we have our big spring book sale. You know, we have roughly 2 book sales per year, and our spring book sale is coming up this Thursday through Saturday during library hours. So please come by and buy some used books and support the library that way. Also, if you come Thursday evening from 6 to 8, we are going to have members of the Newton Mid-Kansas Symphony Orchestra providing chamber music in the library. So that will be a lot of fun. Then on Friday and Saturday, this is a busy week for us because on Friday evening at 7, we have the authors of We the House, Warren Ashworth and Susan Kander, and they are joining us at the Workington House Museum, not the library, but the Workington House Museum, for a reading from their book, and that's going to be really cool. And that one will actually be live streaming on Facebook, so you can also watch it that way. And then again with Warren, he's an architect, and he's going to be back at the Workington House 4 p.m. on Saturday to give a lecture on balloon framing, and which is a building technique, which is how the Ambleside House and the Workington House were built, and it had a big impact on westward expansion and picking up the pace of home building in America. Let me see what else. Another one online. I'm going to try to do it online as well as in person. Will be Tuesday of next week, the 26th at 7 p.m. We'll have Sean Tomlinson joining us for our 4th Tuesday photography series. He recently went on an expedition to Death Valley and took some really beautiful photos. So he's going to talk about that trip and how he made these images, which are really awesome. That's not all that's going on, but I could go on, and I don't want to have it all just be about the library. So I'll go ahead but before I do turn it over to Marlena and Ed, just a housekeeping note, I guess. I'm sure many of you I've seen people saying hello and where they're from in the chat, and that's great. You can continue to do that. If you have questions, those of you on Zoom can type them into the Q&A button, and then we will hold those for after their presentation and have that interactive part at the end. And those of you on our Facebook Live as well can type your questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring that and feed those questions over. And I think Marlena and Ed also had some folks that they recognized and thought it would be good to have you come on camera, or at least turn your microphone on during that Q&A period and have it be really lively. So I guess you guys, Marlena and Ed, can call out who they'd like me to do that to, or or you can send a message to me or put it in the chat, and I will enable your microphone and or video camera at the proper time. So that's enough from me. I'll turn it over to the authors here, and can't wait to learn from you and all that good stuff. So thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having us. Good to be with you this evening.
It's wonderful to be here.
So I'm supposed to introduce us.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're among the overeducated of our society. We were both university professors at the College of Business at the University of Colorado. And we had a public speaking business together and a consulting business together to the healthcare industry. And I think that's enough about our background.
Yeah.
We retired from that several years ago. And at this point in time are devoting ourselves to writing books, articles, doing YouTubes. And it's led us to be with you this evening. And I feel very fortunate to be here.
Yeah, Sam, thank you for having us. I thought I would just, as Ed says, our focus now is the writing, YouTubing. We have some podcasts. I think that Sam will share our website, marlenafiol.com, later tonight. But I thought we'd start with where this all started, with Called. because we promised a bit of a backstory here, the stuff that's not in the book. In 2007, 3 years before Clara Schmidt, my mother, died, she had boxes, numerous boxes full of journals and diaries and letters and articles and books that they had written, that were written about them, very personal material, very published material. She handed it to me and she said, Marlena, you're my writer. I want you to write our story.
I think you explained to her you weren't that kind of writer.
At the time, I was a business professor and consultant, and that was not the kind of writing I was interested in. But I took her boxes.
And had no knowledge as to whether or not you could do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very different kind of capability.
And I think we've moved 4 times since we actually pulled all of the material out of those boxes. But we hold those boxes with us with each move. And 7 years ago, decided to look at what was in those boxes. And Ed has been the head researcher, and for 7 years, he has gone through every bit of paper in those boxes, as well as many, many published documents about John and Clara Schmidt. So we have very private material about their inner lives, as well as public material. And it was
people in the archives, for example, in Akron, Pennsylvania, at the Mennonite Central Committee were extraordinarily helpful. And the boxes and boxes of materials they brought out were unbelievable. So we photograph it all and then bring it back with us. And that winds up being another year or two of digging. Goshen College, for sure.
And the archivist at the Fadenheim Mennonite colony in the Chaco of Paraguay, Gundolf Niebuhr, was very, very helpful with a lot of material. So anyway, we took a look at this, and after years of research, realized that this is no longer just responding to a mother's plea to write their story. This went way beyond that. And Ed and I both realized this is a story that we want to and need to and feel compelled to share with the world.
I mean, Dr. John and Clara were people who saw the world the way it was and found it unacceptable. And they devoted 60 years of their life to epic work. And we've tried to capture it to the best of our ability.
And so it
is well documented, I just will say, to complete.
Yeah.
There are 720 references that we have used and documented for this writing, but that doesn't even come close to the vast amount of material that we went through. So I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, that's great. So the story opens in 1941. John Schmidt, a single, dashing, crazy 30-year-old Kansas Mennonite, gets on a ship and travels to this place called Paraguay. And his partner on that ship is Ori Miller, who was at the time the head of MCC. And I have often said to Ed that this is a book about John and Clara, but it's sort of kind of a book about Ori Miller, because he's kind of with them through this. And for anyone in the audience who's in our group here tonight who is old enough to remember MCC from back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you know Ori Miller, you know the name well. And it's certainly,
without him, there's no MCC, I would speculate, if I might say.
Yeah. So, and then the ending, we can talk a bit about the parts in between, but the book ends in 2001 when there is a 50th anniversary of Kilometer 81, which is the leprosy station that John and Clara founded in 1951 in Paraguay. So in 2001, there was a big 50th anniversary, and they were present. My 7 siblings and I were all present, and there were, I don't know, hundreds of people there. So the book ends during that celebration, and we can talk more about what's between the beginning and the end. Maybe you want to talk just briefly about the sort of the 3 areas that we covered in the book without too much detail.
Yeah, without much detail, for sure. I mean, it's an epic story that goes on starting in 1941, as Marlena said, And Dr. John comes north and he marries Clara, his wife, devoted partners throughout a long history together. And they go back to the Chaco of Paraguay and open back up a hospital, start a nursing school. And that nursing school is still operating very effectively, as I understand it, there at this point in time. And they leave behind them a world that maybe still exists because of what they created and gave to it, I would think, based upon our research. They come back to the United States in 1950 or 1946, 1951. They are excited because they have an opportunity to go back to Paraguay and contribute. And this is when MCC and the American Leprosy Mission, ALM, are thinking maybe we could build a leprosy colony in Paraguay. Dr. John is devoted to the idea of not locking leprosy patients up. They are not lepers. I will never allow them to be called lepers.
And yeah, just a quick insert there. In 1951 and before, leprosy patients were treated as criminals. They were locked up. This was a very revolutionary idea to go to their homes to treat them. So,
and I think I skipped a piece that might have been important to our audience. Dr. John is from Gossel, Kansas, from Alexander Walt. I start to get teary-eyed when I think of these two people and what they accomplished in the world. Clara was from First Mennonite, or grew up in Newton, Kansas, and went to Bethel, had an undergraduate degree, and beyond that went on to get a nursing degree, so that she and Dr. John together were lifelong medical partners. They did open the leprosy station that they thought was the proper way to treat leprosy patients. They were opposed by MCC at certain points in time. They were opposed by the American Leprosy Mission, and they were opposed by the government of Paraguay, who said their way of treating leprosy patients was not acceptable, and possibly Paraguay may have wished them to get medical licenses in Paraguay. Dr. John found that unacceptable also. So they went out in the backwoods of Paraguay and found leprosy patients, treated them in their homes. And as a result of their work, that is the way leprosy is treated on the planet today, rather than locking these people together as prisoners. I will stop with that. That ends in 1971. Skipping forward through many years of service in one form or another, they then went to Tres Palmas in the early 1990s.
This is in East Paraguay.
In East Paraguay, as an elderly couple, and once more saved the community and saved the hospital. Both are effectively operating today, and I question whether they would exist. They used their own resources. They used their own resources to build roads into Tres Palmas, for example, to make it a viable community.
Yeah, I want to insert here that we tend to, as a society, and I don't think it's just the US, we tend to put male heroes on a bit of a pedestal. And John Schmidt was definitely a hero. He was a stubborn, fierce change maker. However, and this is the part I want to insert, the peacemaker in this partnership was Clara Regier Schmidt. And that partnership was as powerful as it was, because of the two of them, the fierce change maker and the peaceful, calming energy of the peacemaker. And I know that my brother Wesley, who is hearing this, is sitting there nodding. We as children even saw that. And so it's just a really important insertion here to recognize that fierce change requires also the peacemaking. Edgar Stoess,
that's where I was going to go,
who is actually featured in the book called was an MCC representative in Paraguay during very, very challenging years for the Schmidts when they transitioned from the leprosy station. And he is still alive, and he is a huge supporter of this writing and of our book, which is very validating to have.
And he said,
to have a former leader of the Mennonite Central Committee who was there during the time we're writing about, be this supportive of
John
the
made
book.
waves. Clara came along behind him and stilled the waters.
Yeah, she calmed things down behind him.
Down.
Yeah.
And together they move forward effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can move on from there. One of the things you could tell us a story that I think is a great story, given what you just set up, is to tell the story of Clara putting the bricks into the mortar when the people come out with rocks, possibly somewhat intoxicated, in the back of a truck to kill them and knock down the leprosy work, knock down the station.
This is one of the scenes in the book. It takes place in 1952.
Probably.
The leprosy station is under construction. And so the bricks are being made and the mud is being mixed up in the bricks to build these buildings. My father, John Schmidt, was in Brazil investigating what people there were doing about leprosy. And Clara was on the station where this construction was taking place. And she's working on the construction, and a truck comes over the hill, and there are a bunch of men with bottles, and they're screaming, and they seem intoxicated, and they're yelling about
speaking a language she can't understand.
Lepra de Satán, and que mueran todos, and basically death wishes for anyone who would bring leprosy patients into their neighborhood, right, into their community. So they were extremely angry. They got down from the truck, they picked up rocks. They were intending to destroy her and the work. And to make a long story short, and it is a scene in the book for anyone who wants the details, but she invited them for coffee and zwieback. And those of you who are Mennonites in our, and I think most of you probably are listening to this, viewing this, you know what zwieback are. She said, come have coffee and zwieback. And she prayed with them, and they ate zwieback and drank coffee with her. They left and they never came back. And it's one of our favorite stories about Clara, for sure. We could go on, but I'm kind of interested in hearing what people in the audience are thinking about and what they'd like to know more about.
If that works for you, Sam.
I'm inclined, we could go on and on. Maybe you have some questions for us, Sam, or we can turn to people who are listening.
Yeah, great. Let's see, we have had a few questions come in, and those of you watching can I'll type in the chatter on Facebook. We did have somebody just asked, what is zwieback? It's a
okay.
Not everybody knows.
Not everybody knows. Okay, so zwieback is a kind. It's a roll. It's a roll. It has two parts. Some of you in the audience are just laughing because I'm not describing it very well, and many of you could describe it a lot better. But there's a roll at the bottom, and then there's a little roll on the top. So it's zwie, which is sort of zwieback, which means zweibach, two baked things together. It's a roll. So basically,
that's the short version.
Basically, rolls and coffee.
Oh, look at that! Go get him, Sam.
There you go. Thank you, Sam. Yep.
Sam, we can no longer hear you. I don't know.
I muted myself.
There you go.
Wesley Schmidt, he typed, can you mention the role of Anna? And actually, Wesley, I know he's someone that is connected to this, right, in a big way. So if you like, Wesley, I can actually put you on camera. I don't know if he's set up for that or not, but.
If he is, we would love for him to be part of this presentation because he is also a very important, while we're working on getting Wesley set up. And yes, we'll talk about Anna, but let me just say that Wesley is not only our brother and John and Clara Schmidt's son. He stepped into John Schmidt's shoes on the leprosy station and was the director and the physician at the leprosy station for a number of years. And so he plays a very, very important role, not only in my heart and in our family, but also in the book. And there he is.
Hey, brother-in-law.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Good to hear you and see you.
So Anna is a character in the book that Wesley was asking about. Anna is actually a combination, amalgamation of a number of people and forces in John and Clara Schmidt's life. And she represents, one of the things she represents is to change the world through force. So she's Argentinian, and she is going to revolutionize and work for justice in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, and she's going to do it through force. And John's approach is no, doing it by force brings about simply more force. That is not the way to bring about change. And so it was a way to bring out the big differences between these different approaches to changing the world, either through force or through pacifist means. Yeah.
I opened up the microphone. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
I can. And
Well,
I'm sorry, Wesley, go ahead.
I was going to mention I'm pretty well acquainted with the entire life of our parents, and the image of Anna in this book just had me puzzled all the way through. I said, I never knew that Dad had this kind of interaction with a fancy lady in Buenos Aires. It was so real and very well done, very well done. And so I think this was it makes the book also so much more interesting. But as you say, it brings out these different ways of approaching how to make changes in the world. I think, and for those of you who are looking at this, I've already talked to quite a few of my friends who've read the book, and it's just reading it is a very good experience. It's actually exciting to read this, and you basically want to keep on going to see how this is going to end. Very well done, Marlena. I'm proud of you.
Oh, thank you. Good. Thank you. So someone in the chat just asked if Wesley was a doctor, and yes, absolutely. He was actually the medical advisor to the president at one point. So he's of Paraguay. He's been way up there in the ranks. So he is most definitely a renowned doctor in his own right. Yes.
And one of the things he contributed to this book that we're talking about, called, was Wesley was kind enough to write a current day description of life in the Chaco in Fahrenheit, these many years after your parents were there and made such an incredible impact on it. And he has also been kind enough to write, and also included in the book, a description of Kilometer 81 and the leprosy treatment at Kilometer 81.
So that's a real treat, because when you read the book, you get an update.
Here's how it really turned out.
Here's how it turned out in all three of those areas that our parents were involved in. Yeah.
And actually, I'm a Kansas farm boy turned Chaqueño. I'm now a citizen of the Chaco and no longer a doctor. So
he's a rancher and a doctor.
For those of you who don't know, the Chaco is a region of West Paraguay, and it was the first place where John Schmidt landed in 1941, when he was a physician for immigrants who'd come over fled from the Ukraine, actually,
Yes.
Which is pretty.
In the 1930s.
Yeah, pretty crazy to think about now as we have people fleeing from the Ukraine again. But he was the physician for this colony of immigrants when they had no other physician in 1941 in West Paraguay.
Just to tie Anna back in before we move on, I understand you did not know about such a character in your father's life, Wes. But if you think back to his life in Baltimore, possibly long before he knew your mother, there were some very well-to-do people in his life, and he made a choice. He could have lived the fancy life in Baltimore, but he wanted to get back to his own people.
Yeah.
And that's what drew him to the Chaco.
So someone wants to know whether you, Wesley, can speak to why you decided to stay in Paraguay.
Well, I grew up here. I had the opportunity to study medicine here. And actually, someone was saying did their PAC service, their Peace Corps service. I came to Paraguay with a PAC service during the Vietnam years, where I was a conscientious objector. And with the 2 years of service here, I felt like this was a place where I wanted to basically stay. And I studied medicine here. I eventually did some specialization in the States, but and my wife is she was here just a minute ago, but she's from Paraguay, and she did not adapt very well to the American culture. So I have no problems. I have adapted very well to our culture here. So that's probably the main reason we're here.
I could say one little point about that. Wes and his 3 brothers are in Paraguay. Marlena and her 3 sisters, 2 of her 3 sisters are here in the United States. Now, I don't know how anybody would interpret the women coming to the United States and the men staying in Paraguay. I will let that out there for people to think about. But by the way, for those who may not represent, I'm sitting very close to Wesley's sister. I am also her husband. Before that's sitting out there, we didn't bother
to say that. That's true.
Before he needs to take me on here in the situation.
We thought you were his father, her father.
Oh, that's cruel. That's cruel. You're not so young yourself there, old man. Anyway, moving along. Unless you would like to say more, Wes, I appreciate any insight you have that you want to bring to the situation.
Absolutely.
Including about Kilometer 81 at this point, or about the Chaco at this point.
I can just, while Wesley's thinking about that, I can build on one of the things Wesley said about Ana, that she brings the Argentinian history a bit to the forefront. So anyone who's a real history buff, I think, will appreciate those aspects of the book. There is the Nazi uprisings among Mennonites, pacifist Mennonites in the Chaco of Paraguay in the 1940s, who were pro-Nazi, pro-Hitler, and that's described in the book for history buffs. There's also a pretty weaving in constantly the history of Argentina and Paraguay over those years. And so, yes, it is about John and Clara and their work. It's also about the larger context in which they lived and worked.
It's a story of adventure. It's a story of romance, and it is a story of political intrigue throughout the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. I've got 2 questions that came in that I think are kind of linked. On Zoom, Elena asked, Wesley, what was the attitude toward those with leprosy during the years you were at Kilometer 81? And then actually my parents on Facebook, they're watching, they asked, what are the misunderstandings of the leprosy disease that led to the incarceration of infected people? So those kind of go together.
Yeah, I'll be happy. I still connected. I'll be happy to comment on the stigma that especially in the 50s went with being a leprosy patient, because there was a leprosy colony, as Marlena said, patients were taken there at gunpoint. They were locked in an area where they could not get out into the normal society. So being a leprosy patient was a sentence, a life sentence. And so obviously people who really wanted to keep their relatives close and loved their relatives would hide them away, and they would be in some back room in a lot of cases. That was in the 50s. And with this whole process of being able to treat leprosy, finding out that people with treatment are not contagious, and as we've learned more and more, it's become, at least in Paraguay, much less of a stigma. We still have new patients showing up all the time, most of them in the initial phase of the disease. They're cured with the medications, and there's not a lot of stigma related to leprosy patients anymore here in Paraguay, but it certainly was the case in the 50s. And I think it's worth mentioning that the Mennonite colonies in Paraguay, where John was his first years as a doctor and had very interesting experiences relating to the German Nazi movement within this pacifist group. Coming back to Paraguay, he was at Kilometer 81 representing the churches of the Chaco, and they give him full support. And so he's, in spite of the fact that he had some rough times in the Mennonite colonies in the Chaco, and that's very well depicted in the book, later on in life, he and Clara had the full support of the Mennonite churches, and they basically still feel that this project, which is it's grown and it's become more and more complex with hospital but the Mennonites continue to feel that this is a thank you project to the Paraguayan government for having received them as immigrants from Ukraine way back in the 80, 90 years ago.
Yep. And that was John Schmidt's major focus.
Absolutely.
He sometimes said, it's not even as important to me that we treat leprosy patients. It's the most important thing is that we find a way for the Mennonites of Paraguay to thank the Paraguayan government for allowing them to come in. That was such a huge, huge piece of it for him.
And before he was willing to go to Paraguay in 1951, he came to an agreement that this leprosy station would belong to the Mennonites of Paraguay. It wasn't a North American gig. That was simply the way to get it started.
Yep.
And I guess that kind of question from Daryl about how John first became interested in going to Paraguay. And so is that kind of what led him to go down there, and or what's the how did you first get interested?
Yeah, so he graduated with his from his internship in Baltimore in 1941. And at that time, MCC was looking for someone who would be a physician for this group of immigrants who had landed in the Chaco of Paraguay, who had no doctor. They contacted Herb Schmidt, whom some of you may know or know of, in Newton, Kansas. And Herb Schmidt was a physician busy basically building his career in Newton and
taking care of people during the war effort in the United States.
He was very busy, but he says, I have a brother who might be interested. A telegram arrived. John Schmidt read the telegram, and he used to tell this story, and I used to think he was exaggerating, but actually we have it now. We have the telegram that went back. It took him minutes to say yes. Minutes.
He didn't know quite what he had said yes to, but it was an adventure.
That's right.
It was an exciting
If I
opportunity
might
to
say-
serve.
If I might say, I remember him telling me that he received the telegram. He was all excited. He was that type of person, anyways. But
Yes.
he said yes, and then he went down to the library to see where Paraguay was.
Paraguay was.
Absolutely.
He knew it was someplace in South America.
And I will say here, and I think that this is reflected in the writing of Called. John Schmidt was a devout Christian. He believed that he was doing God's work, no question about it. John Schmidt was also an adventure seeker. He loved going to the edge of risk-taking. It just brought him alive. And so that combination is potent. Serve others, follow God's calling, and love risk-taking adventure is a very potent mix, and it drove him throughout his life.
And some of the adventures, some of the risk-taking, the stories were too outlandish to put in Called. They are not there, but they are coming forth in yet a third book.
We're writing
that
a third
working
book.
on,
Yeah.
which takes us to the edge of his adventures and his self-reflection on them.
And it's a book, we can go just for a short bit, and then we'll go back to Called. Our third book is, as Ed says, the snippets of the really crazy adventures. It is also what ties the book together is the inner life of John Schmidt. So this person who changed the world, and in many ways had a hard time looking at his own insecurities, his own fears. And so we are charting, based on information that we have, the inner life of this hero that in some ways is a bit of a tragic hero. He did so much to make the world a better place, and there was so little ability to look inside and reflect on his own insecurities and fears. Sometimes those are what drove him. So,
And Wesley, we have a psychotherapist involved in this work. I think you know her. Her name's Mary Lou.
Mary Lou,
She's
she's involved in helping us with the third book, and this relates to
she is also Marlena's sister and Wesley's sister.
This
so
relates
that
to a question
clear.
that's in the chat right now, and that is, what are the names of our brothers and sisters, Wesley? So I will just start from the top. John Russell is the oldest. Wesley and I think he was adopted, but he doesn't he doesn't accept that as truth. So he's the oldest. Elizabeth is second in line. Wesley is the third. David, then myself, then Mary Lou, then Chris, and then Josie. So there are 8 of us.
And we better take back just a little bit the part about being adopted.
Oh, that was a joke. That's a family
people may
joke.
go, what?
No. It's a family joke.
Yeah, someone was asking about, am I still on the Pan American trip? And I just want to say, it depends on who tells you about the trip. If you ask my sisters, they think it was a horrible experience. The 3 of us guys think it was a unforgettable adventure that I still want to do it again sometime. And it was quite an adventure for our family to take 3 months to travel by car from Paraguay to Kansas. There's a little of this in this book, but that was also part of Dad's one of his crazy, wonderful ideas.
This what Wesley is referring to is the 3-month trip that our whole family. There were only 6 kids at that point, so 8 of us locked up into a little Volvo
without windows that went down in the back.
It was horrible.
Just to set this up.
And we drove from Paraguay to Kansas. That's what Wesley is referring to. And there are some scenes in the book. Someone just asked me what the names of the other 2 books are. And so the first book was actually my memoir, which is Nothing Bad Between Us. It is it's really a love story about me and my father. We had very tough times, and there was a lot of forgiveness and a lot of really goodness that happened between us. And that's what my memoir celebrates.
It's a great story of vulnerability and healing.
Yeah. And then Called is the second. And then the third one, the running title of the third book is Healing the Wound, One Layer at a Time. But that's a running title. Who knows what it'll be. And someone said in the chat just now that the legacy of the Schmidts continues in Paraguay today. And I could not agree more. And in fact, that is for me what those updates represent, that Wesley and David, my two brothers, wrote the updates at the end of Called. And it has a lot to do with their presence and the legacy that continues. And so thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, here we go. Yeah.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
There we go. I'll master this mute button someday. Let's see. Patrice has a question on Zoom, and I also kind of have a maybe a related question. She wrote, curious about the roles you both played in writing the book. You mentioned that Ed did a lot of the research. How did you handle the actual writing? Did one of you take the lead in that regard? And then I guess I wanted to add, my understanding is that, obviously this is a nonfiction story with a lot of facts, but then you kind of wrote it in a sort lightly fictionalized way. Is that correct? Could you talk about that and how you figured out the approach to writing this book?
Okay, let's start with our writing process.
We've written together for years.
Decades.
We were academics, university professors who had offices next to each other. We had a business together. It is a little unusual for married couples to work well together. And we have had it as an important part of our life. I don't know what our life would be like if we did not have this piece also built in. So
Ed takes the lead on the research. He spent 7 years.
Not full time, I might add. I'm not quite that slow.
No, it was just a lot of research for Called. I do the first draft. I write the first drafts of our writing. And then I ship it over to Ed, who then gives me critiques and
which are not always fully well accepted.
Criticizes what I've written, and then we
fight about it.
We fight about it. We do. We fight a lot.
We do. And we have an intense relationship.
And we both agree that when we're done fighting, the product is one that we're proud of and that is better than it was before we fought about how it should be done. And so the process now, when we're in the fighting mode, we by now we understand that this is something we have to go through, and it'll be better as a result. It's a great thing to have a feel for that, so that it isn't a real downer when we have disagreements and arguments. Yeah. So about the yes, it is nonfiction, and every piece of that book represents true forces and people in John and Clara's life. However, given the many people and the data,
60 years of data, you can't put every character in there without turning out an almanac.
We had to create amalgams and there are at least four characters in the book that represent an amalgamation of real characters and forces and not a single person. So I've had people ask me,
am I that character?
We've had people
Absolutely.
ask, like, for example, who was Konrad Wolf really? Well, Konrad Wolf was 4 people wrapped up into one. And what is important here is that to us, it's less important to identify Konrad Wolf by name and who those 4 people really were. What's important is to recognize what those forces were and what those people represented in John and Clara's life. And other people are named by name, clearly. I mean, Ori Miller is one. The head of the American Leprosy Mission over time is named by name.
2 different heads.
Yep. and other MCC representatives are named by name. So it varies a bit. Great question.
Yes, thank you. Let's see. Anne asked on Zoom, voluntary service seemed to be an important part of John and Claire's plans for Kilometer 81 and the ways for Mennonites to say thank you. Is there still such a program in the Chaco? I think you might have talked about this a little bit, right?
We should turn that over to Wes.
First of
I can
all,
speak.
yes, Wesley, I want you to speak to that. But I would just say, I would just really support what you said, and that is that voluntary service, this was John's big thing. It was one of the most important reasons that he believed that Kilometer 81 should be started, was for the voluntary service program. And Wesley, why don't you talk about what it looks like today?
Yeah, voluntary service here in Paraguay has grown to be a major institution, supported again by the Mennonite churches, mainly the German-speaking churches. But as some of you know, there are hundreds of other churches, native Paraguayans, Indians, and they're all getting involved in this. So it's a major, and it's still continuing at Kilometer 81 at the Leprosy Hospital, but it also is in orphanages and VIH service, which our brother David started and headed, and many other places.
Let me just translate for my Paraguayan brother. That would be HIV.
Okay. Right,
Yeah.
VIH.
So that everybody here understands.
So everybody
it.
understands. Yeah.
HIV in Spanish is VIH, correct?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And in Spanish we say AIDS, which is really not at all Spanish. So yeah, so this has grown. This has grown tremendously from that time, but it's a continuation of what Marlena very well shows us in this story that they wrote. Marlena and Ed, yeah.
And it did start with your father and your mother.
Yes.
And that's the point that I really want anybody to miss in this process.
Yeah.
This thing that you just described that has expanded so.
Yeah.
Your father, and as you well know, Wes, was very aware of voluntary service in the United States and believed it was incredibly valuable and that it needed to occur in Paraguay. And in fact, Kilometer 81 gave him an excuse to take that to Paraguay.
Yeah, and he talked about the importance of the thank you to Paraguay. However, there was another thing that he pounded, and we see it in his writing over and over and over again, and that is service is essential for the spiritual well-being of a people, of individuals and communities. Service is essential. To be able to serve others is so essential to spiritual growth. And that was just such a focus of his, and like over and over. Yeah.
And the great thing about your father was that he didn't just verbalize these beliefs, he lived them. And I think that distinguishes him from so many people in our world. He took them out on the road, he made them happen, and he lived his life so that they would come into practice, whether it's voluntary service or several other contributions he made.
Yeah. And then Anne added, MCC meat canning would not have happened this year in the US had we not had a volunteer from the Chaco who agreed to come back to help us out for a few months. So the gift keeps giving.
That's great. Around and
I
around.
love that.
Mm-hmm.
Love
Very
that.
touching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I've also got a question from Steve Richards, who I'll say Steve is I believe the past president of Kansas Paraguay Partners, and which is people to people tours they arrange, and also I think reciprocal volunteer service between Paraguay and Kansas. And so Steve kind of shared this event with people in that community. So hello to you all that found out about this through that. And he asks, as you introduced yourselves, I think you said something about healthcare as an aspect of your professional work and writing. Could you describe some of that context?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So, as I said, I think in our introductions, we had a speaking business and a consulting business together for 20, 25 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. Our focus was to the healthcare industry. Our work was with hospitals, health systems, physician leaders, physician practices.
It was on the management
Side of it, not
of
the medical
healthcare
side.
rather than the medical side.
In the United States, as many of the people who are here this evening are well aware, healthcare is going through phenomenal transition from the 1980s through the 1990s and beyond. And we just happened to catch it at that time and brought what we knew from the leadership world and the strategy world and the conflict resolution world, et cetera, to the people who were our clients. And had a blast doing it.
Yeah.
It's amazing. We have had a privileged life. We have enjoyed what we do, and people have been willing to pay us for it. And that is a very privileged life.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the privilege continues. It is.
People aren't paying us much for it anymore.
We were interviewed on KAKE TV. Is it called Cake TV or KAKE?
Yeah, I think we call it Cake. Tend to call it
Cake TV.
right?
Okay,
Yeah.
so this morning we were interviewed on Cake TV, and the person interviewing us said, "You have a bestseller, and this is about your parents, and this is a bestseller.
Yeah.
How does that feel?" And I'm not sure I'd ever been asked how does it feel, and I blurted it out because it's from my heart. I feel honored, and I feel privileged.
Yeah.
Because this story, it's not about it being our parents, Wesley. It's about, this is a story I think this world is longing for right here, right now, with all the anger and the divisiveness. And we want to be inspired.
Yes.
And this inspires. And so, yeah, privileged and honored to be the vehicle. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just remind everybody that, the Q&A and the chat, and also on Facebook, you can type your questions. But I have a question. At a certain point, I guess leprosy became this treatable illness and often curable even with antibiotics and other treatments. When did that kind of revolution come about? And then how would that affect, like when was that came about in the treatment of leprosy, and how did that affect things in Paraguay?
We would normally jump into answering that question, but we have Dr. Wesley.
We have an expert here.
And there's no way I'm going to answer that question with the doc on the phone or on the
and that fits very well into this whole story, because the sulfa drugs, which were our first antibiotics, came into general use in the 40s, in the late 40s. And so when this leprosy work began in 1951, there was a knowledge that the sulfa drug did in fact improve the situation of leprosy patients. And over the next 20 or 30 years, this medication was used, and the medical, we realized that it did not cure the disease, but it arrested the progression of the disease and made it non-infectious. Then in the 80s, all kinds of other medications came into the horizon, and some of these have been very effective. I was fortunate to be a doctor at Kilometer 81 in 1978. No, 1975 to 1978.
Yes.
Yep.
And some of these medications were experimental at that time, but Kilometer 81 was quite well known. So we got medications from Germany, which I was able to administer to the patients, do all the testing, biopsies, and so forth, to actually see that these medications were effective. And of course now leprosy is treated in just normal hospitals, although Kilometer 81 continues to be the referral center. But they've looked for other people with stigma, and that's HIV. I said it correctly this time. HIV patients are being seen there. They've gone into mental health. They've gone in, and of course, there's a clinic that treats a general clinic. So the Kilometer 81 picture now is totally different than it was even in the 80s and 90s when our parents finally kind of stepped out of this area.
What the listener may or may not have picked up from that description is that in 1951, when Wes, Marlena, and their siblings went to Kilometer 81, the leprosy station that their parents were building, nobody quite knew what caused leprosy, but it was God's work to go there. And that so represents Dr. John and Clara. It was God's work. And fortunately, none of you siblings contacted the disease. We now know that, as Wes pointed out, it is not nearly the infectious disease that there was a concern about, but that does not mean that some people still do not become infected. It is, I think the number on the planet is very similar to the number in 1951.
It's
It's
remained
pretty flat.
stable.
The
Yeah.
difference is, as Wes pointed out, they can be treated effectively.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm glad to see the doctor nodding his head because I was concerned it might be, a little
Yeah,
off there, but it's
That's so interesting, and it makes me think about, of course, what we've gone through with an infectious disease the last few years and are still going through.
yes.
Are there parallels that you've drawn or lessons that we can learn from this history that
Yes.
for our present day in COVID?
Are we willing to learn is a question, but there are lessons we might learn. Please go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, I think one of the things that we have talked about and written about, Ed and I, is that just like leprosy back in the 1950s or before, and COVID-19 today, there is so much uncertainty, but more importantly, there's so much divisiveness about what is going on. There's this set of beliefs and there's this set of beliefs, and we will not listen to or talk to each other about those. And I think the John and Clara worked tirelessly for a decade before their approach to treating leprosy patients really became accepted.
And acknowledged by ALM as the treatment on the planet.
Had there been less divisiveness and more listening, more caring what others believe, and more dialogue, that could have happened more quickly. And I think that is, for me, the main lesson for us today, is that those of us who know the truth about COVID,
Or think we know the truth.
that's what I mean. We think we know, and we're not listening to anyone, and we're not therefore finding really good common solutions as a whole community, as opposed to divisive fighting about it. And to me, that's the real lesson.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's see. I think it's almost 8, and I don't see any more questions in the queue at the moment. So if you've got something burning in your mind, last chance to type it in.
Sure.
But before we go, I definitely want to. The websites, I'll go ahead and type those in the chat. Well, those of you on Facebook, in the description of the video, you'll see the links to marlenafiol.com and callasaga.com. And I'll put those in the chat on Zoom as well. But then could you also just tell us, where people are interested in buying the book, how would they go about that?
So I think the way authors say that is it's available where all good books are sold.
All fine books are sold.
All fine books are sold.
Now the truth.
It's naturally available on Amazon. Also, any bookstore will carry it if you ask them to order it. All bookstores clearly do not carry it, but if you go into a bookstore, into your local bookstore, and ask for it, it is Ingram Spark is the wholesaler, and so it's easy for the bookstore to order it. It
is available both in written form, paper form. It's available as an ebook, and it's available as an audiobook. And we were very, very fortunate with our narrator. This guy's extraordinary. We wrote this stuff, and when we listened to him read it, back came the tears.
Yeah,
He's a wonderful narrator. He's able to take a young John Schmidt from being 30 years of age and age him with the voice beautifully. He's able to do the accents from the various languages that show up in the book. So we were really blessed. And his name is?
Jack Warren. Yeah, he's a great narrator.
He's a pro.
I would just like to say in closing, because we are at the end of the hour, that this book does not present an idealized version of John and Clara Schmidt. We have talked so much about the things that they accomplished, and yes, it's extraordinary. But what I want to point out is that we describe them as ordinary and even broken people,
humans,
who were human
people.
Beings, as we all are, who were able to do the extraordinary because of a love of God and because of their belief in the dignity of every human being, especially those who are marginalized. And that is what we believe makes it inspirational. It's not the idealized, amazing people who did amazing things. It's people like you or I, who were driven by a love of God and the belief in what could happen if they showed up.
Nice.
Yes, thank you. That's really an inspiring message and something to really think about and try to incorporate into our own lives. I would also add, Krista asked, is this being recorded? Yes, it is. And just as soon as I adjourn the webinar here, you can go to our Facebook page, or just search for Newton Public Library, Kansas on Facebook, and it may take a few minutes to post, but it'll be on the videos tab, and you can watch it there. You can share the link from there right away. And then as soon as I can, I will also get the recording edited and put it on our YouTube channel. So it'll be, so if you want to share it with your friends or watch part of it again, you can do that.
I want to thank you, Sam. This was amazing. And now I'm going to try not to cry when I thank my brother. This was a bonus. We had no idea that he was even going to show up. And so thank you so much, Wesley, for being here with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wouldn't miss it. I wouldn't miss it for $1 million.
Oh, thanks, Wes. And thank you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a pleasure, and I know I'm speaking for everybody. We'd love to have you back when you publish your next book, or when you have something else that you'd like to talk about with us. It was great.
Would love to.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you all for being here.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. And I'll sign us off now. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.